Finish doing your stuff. Come on.
So that's another.
Yeah, probably one more of those. Yeah, maybe another day. Tired. I got a lot of stuff already done.
You can press.
Hey guys, thank you so much for taking time out to watch our little skit, and I hope we found it interesting. And we do that because we want you to see some practical examples of what the everyday occurrences in relationships can look like. Now, they vary from person to person and household to household, of course, but we just wanted to give you a little bit of a background as to what we're going to be talking about today. Today, we are talking about core fears. Core fears. And what are core fears?
Core fears are fears that operate at the very core levels or the fundamental levels of who we are. You should have done your homework, and your homework was an exercise that would help you to be able to identify your core fears and your responses.
Right.
And so what you witnessed in that video was an example of my core fear being touched or being pressed, my fear button being pressed by an exchange that my wife and I had. You know, and I was asking, hey, can we be intimate tonight? And my wife, you know, I got three buzzes. Bam! You know, it's like 3 strikes you're out type of thing. And my response, you know, I didn't get into that, but we'll talk about the responses when our core fear buttons are pushed.
So if you are actually watching this video right now, you should have already completed the core fear test. If you have not, we're going to ask you to stop the video. Go and download the core fear test at staminaforlife.com. That is www.stamena4life.com. Under the resource tab, you'll be able to find the core fear test. You can download it for free and utilize it.
Now, there's one thing. You do have to you have to join or subscribe.
Yes.
In order to have free access to that.
Yes, so make sure you do that. So if you have not taken that test yet, go ahead and stop the video now and come back after you've completed it. So you've completed the core fear test, you and your spouse or your potential spouse, correct? And you've discovered some things about yourself. That should be what we're doing right now. But before we do that, we want to kind of show or discuss with you why the core fear test has been such an impactful part of our marriage. In the beginning stages of our marriage, we actually had an opportunity to read a book by a gentleman by the name of
Gary Smalley.
Yes.
Gary Smalley. Gary Smalley's book was called The DNA, or is called The DNA of Relationships. And Tamara and I love to read together. We feel like it enhances what we have. It creates teachable moments for us.
Yeah.
You may hear more about that later on. But as we read through the book, we came to an exercise, and it was a core fear test. And I mean, this thing was revolutionary for us. It was revolutionary because it helped us to be able to identify some of what was going on. I mean, we knew the cycle.
Yeah.
In fact, in the book, it calls it a fear dance.
Yes.
We knew and we understood the dance, but we couldn't always identify what the steps were that were leading us into the dance or into the cycle. And before you know it, here we are. Don't really understand how we got here. Kind of tired of being here, but nonetheless, here we are. What do we do from here? How do we stop the cycle? How do we stop the dance?
And what's so interesting about the dance, right? You get into it and you get so used to it that this thing can go on for days, weeks, months, and I hate to say it, there are even some who find themselves in that vicious cycle for years in their relationships.
Yeah, and if when this happens, we've talked to couples, and it's kind of like there's a hopelessness.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing that can be done to do this. It's I don't care what I say. I've said it. This, that, and the other. And that stage of hopelessness in the relationship is reached generally because people do not understand what are the indicators that that you are going into another fear dance. And also, people don't understand what our personal core fears are. One of the other things that was so liberating for me, and Gary Smalley says this in his book, is when we understand our core fears, then what it does is it helps us to take ownership for our own emotions.
Yeah.
And I'm a hypercritical person. And so for me, I was like, okay, what did you do to make me feel like this? If you would only give me more of, or be more, or do this or do that,
Yeah.
then I would be happy. And taking ownership of my own emotions was a profound thing. It liberated me from blaming her or having to depend on Tamara for my happiness. So I took ownership of that. And so that it was a powerful game changer in our relationship.
Another thing that I value about the core fear test is if you have, for instance, grown up in a family or in a dynamic where you weren't necessarily given a vocabulary, right? And what I mean by that is all families develop a, what do you want to call it, a language, you know? That means the way that you communicate one another. And sometimes it's even the way you don't communicate, you know? Communication is not just about what you say. It is also body language. Is it about also walking away from something and not having conversation? And so one of the things that I have found very valuable about the core fear test, it actually breaks down the emotions and the buttons that are being pushed and helps you to put names to it. It helps you to be able to say,
Articulate, yeah.
This is what I'm feeling. As you said, to be able to take personal responsibility and ask myself, you know, why is this? Where is this coming from? Was it you? Right? Is this the first time that I felt this way? Are there other instances? And 9 times out of 10, it's not just the first time it happens between you and your significant other. It has happened someplace else in your life. So it gives you a blueprint to follow, to be able to work through identifying your core fears, what feelings, but also your reactions.
Yeah, because every time one of our core fear buttons is pressed, there's a reaction that goes along with it.
Yeah.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that it's important to be able to know, not for ourselves, but this is a crazy thing. It also helps because when my wife has certain behaviors, I'm able to now, because she has diagnosed this and shared this with me, I'm able to ask, was one of her core fear buttons pressed? Right? And so now this helps the type of conversation we have. Instead of me wanting to take a verbal jab at you now or becoming defensive because I see the attitude that she's displaying, now I can become inquisitive instead of defensive. And I can say, hey, Tamara, is everything okay? Now she might be like, hey, everything is fine or whatever. But now I can continue to probe and I can say, well, look, honey, I noticed this type of response. So, you know, based on what we looked at in our core fears, this is one of the responses. And so I'm asking, and the beautiful thing about it is when our core fear buttons are pressed, before this and even after this, it takes a lot of practice.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
Sometimes we're not even conscious that our core fear buttons have been pressed. We just, you know, the response is so normal for us. Our part of the dance, our part of the cycle is so normal that we don't even stop to think, wait a minute. My boss said this to me, wait a minute. My mom said this, wait a minute. My dad said, wait a minute. My brother said, wait a minute. My wife said. But now, again, after taking personal ownership, there is also there is an awareness. There is an awareness, a self-awareness of, wait a minute, why am I talking to my wife like this? Why am I behaving like this? And it opens a door of opportunity. We believe that the Holy Spirit uses this information to be able to help us to break cycles and to get out of the fear dance, and ultimately helps us to grow and mature as individuals and ultimately as a couple.
You know, that is a part of the process of self-examination, which actually the Bible calls us to do, right? Oftentimes what we do is we analyze others, but very, very few cases do we actually take time to actually think and examine ourselves, right? And that's what I think is very valuable about this. How many times during relationships, encounters with others, do you regret? You wish you could take back, right? That response, or man, if I just would have asked a question, or if I just would have said, man, you know what, this is one of those moments, it's not that serious, you know? And I think that most people would tell you, yeah, I've had that experience in life. That is another valuable thing about exercising this core fear test. Because it's going to take more than once.
Absolutely.
You're going to need to do it over. So download it onto your own computers, print it out, keep one at your job, keep one at school in your book bag. Because what you're doing is you are now being transformed by the renewing of your mind. The Bible talks about that.
You're creating another habit.
Yes.
Right? And the more we do something,
yes,
the more times we do it, the deeper the groove becomes in the mind, and it's habit forming.
Yes.
And so yeah, we do want to encourage you that with this exercise, if you can do it once and you get anything out of it, imagine where you would be if you had done it 20 or 30 times.
Yes.
Imagine how much further along until you no longer need the piece of paper because now it's going on right up here.
Yes.
So a fear button is pressed in the conversation, which she may or may not know. Yes. I may or may not know that I'm pressing. And instead of simply responding and going into the dance, now I'm processing with the aid of the Spirit of God.
Yes.
And it's like, wait a minute, no, not going to go there. Not going to do that. This is how I can take ownership, not only of my emotions, but I can also take ownership of my responses as well.
Yes.
So now Tamara, let's go a little bit let's get into this, how this thing looks like. You've already done the exercise, but we want to share a little bit with you about just about how our exercises went, some of the things we learned, and hopefully in that process, you can see how our core fears and our responses, how they tend to intensify one another so that dance or that cycle becomes so very real.
For us, when we first got married, that was something that was nowhere on my radar whatsoever. Again, as I said earlier, that when you weren't even really given a vocabulary, let alone taught to examine yourself to find out why are you reacting or why does this bother you so much. And so when we first got married, we definitely came into it not really understanding the baggage that we brought with us. And I know for me, one of my biggest core fears, because I have more than one, one of my biggest core fears was the fear of abandonment. And so, a newlywed couple learning how to disagree, learning how to communicate, and
well, I think it's important, Tamara, for you to just touch, even ever so briefly, on why abandonment was one of your core fears.
Absolutely. It was a huge core fear of mine because I had come from a broken home. My parents divorced when I was 9, and so that meant that my father left the home. And when my father left the home, little known to me as a little 8 or 9 year old young lady, I didn't know how that would affect me. And so I had developed, I guess a way of dealing with it, or coping. That's a word. That's a really big word, coping mechanism. And so, but yet I also developed a fear of being abandoned. I also had other, older siblings, men. My idea was that men leave you. My 2 older brothers, they got older and they left, And so I had developed this fear that people leave. And so I brought that with me, not even realizing it, into our marriage.
Yeah, and I think that's important for us to just touch on. The core fears, they don't just come out of a vacuum and appear. They come from somewhere.
Absolutely.
And it's interesting. One of the core fears that I discovered, as we were going through this exercise. Actually, I discovered it a little bit earlier when we went through some material from Ron and Nancy Rocky. But it really just affirmed it. But one of my core fears was rejection, because my mom and dad also separated when I was a child. And there's this psychological thing nobody really can put a finger on why, other than the fact that children tend to internalize things, and children blame themselves when something goes wrong. And this is generally what happens when children's parents separate. And so I internalized my mother and father's separation. And because I was with my mother away from my father, there was a sense of rejection. Maybe the reason my dad is not here is because of something that's wrong with me. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe I'm not together enough. And so, and these thoughts don't always hit us consciously. So you might be thinking, well, I've never thought that before. It's not something that's necessarily conscious, but it's a subconscious or unconscious feeling that manifests itself in various other ways. Go ahead.
And this is not always just relegated to childhood traumas or things like that. We pick up fears along the way as well. We can go through things in life with people who aren't even in our families, right? Whether it's at school or at the job or whatever the case may be. But generally, most of us bring what we come from with us into our relationships, and that doesn't just start the year that we start dating, right?
Yeah.
We bring our baggage or our experiences, no matter how great of a family you may have come from, right? You bring things with you, learned behaviors and thoughts and patterns and effects from things with you into relationships. And oftentimes, as you said, we don't know how these things develop into core fears.
Right. So here I am with a core fear of rejection. And it makes me crave, physical touch, affection, words of affirmation, all of these things. Why? Because my core fear is rejection. But my wife's experience and background that she comes from, those things are not as high on her list as they are on mine. And so when I'm craving this and my wife is not or does not seem to be interested in giving me this, bam, core fear button. So in the video, that's what you saw. Yeah. You saw me saying, hey, we're having a great time. This is wonderful. Man, wouldn't it be a wonderful way to end the night for us to be intimate together, for us to make love together? And she's like, no, I got too much stuff to do. And what that does is it pushes a core fear button of mine, like, man, she doesn't want me. I'm not good enough, so forth and so on.
And I think it's important to talk about this because of the statistics of it. Unfortunately, there's a large statistic of young women and men, for that matter, who have been through molestation, which is part of my story. So I didn't just bring the abandonment. I didn't just bring the abandonment into my relationship, but I brought the experience of molestation from childhood into my relationship. And again, I had no idea how that would show up in my life, especially because I thought that I was successful and I felt like I had overcome, and I didn't become a molester myself. I didn't do all these other things that people say you're supposed to do, so it must be okay. But it shows up, and one of the ways that it showed up for me is that, intimacy wasn't something that was necessarily high, on my radar when it comes to being in a relationship. So imagine me, not really being a physical touch person, marrying someone
who is craving that.
Yes.
Who's craving that.
Yeah.
And so here's where it gets real now, because one of my responses to my core fear button of rejection being pressed is to withdraw.
Yeah.
And if you just think about this, even for a brief second, it makes sense, because if by trying to come close, I'm only hurt and my rejection intensifies,
yes,
then maybe if I just withdraw, then now, because I've withdrawn, what I'm doing is I'm protecting myself from being hurt anymore. So here's what you saw in the video. What that would do is, I would take off the apron and, hey, I'll maybe I'll tell her I'll be back, maybe I wouldn't, and I would go out. I need to get some time. I need to think this thing through. Yeah. What is it? Why do I keep going through this? And I'm processing my thoughts in my mind, because I'm not an arguer. I'm not going to fight. I'm not going, hey, girl, what? I'm not going to do that. So I withdraw myself from the situation. When I withdraw, guess who wants to know where I am now? So because I've been rejected, now I'm like, no, I'm not going to answer you. I need some time to process. I don't respond. And what button does that press?
Abandonment. If I'm trying to find you, you're not responding to me. And this is the thing about core fears. We like to think we're in control of our thoughts and our emotions, but man, oh man, oftentimes we're not. And we begin to have this thing called self-talk, which we may talk to you guys about in another video. But self-talk is very dangerous, because self-talk takes advantage of your fears and begins to tell you lies, right? And so what I mean by that is, if he leaves just to go get a break, just to go step out and get some air, maybe we've had a discussion, or maybe we've had an argument, whatever the case may be.
Or maybe I just can't be intimate with you.
So you need to go get yourself together, whatever the case may be. And when he leaves the house, what my mind says to me is, you know what, he may not come back. What you gonna do then? How you gonna take care of these kids? And it sounds you leap over so many middle things and you go all the way to the end, but that's what self-talk does. That's why self-talk is dangerous. It takes the thoughts and the emotions that we have, it takes advantage of them, and it tells us lies, and it causes us to leap over all of the stuff in the middle that whatsoever is true, whatsoever is lovely, whatsoever is of a good report. We skip over all of that and we leap to the end, to the most drastic thing we can think of. And so what I end up doing is, to survive, right? Because you go into survival mode, is you begin to make plans to not have this individual in your life, right? This is an emotionally immature response. Emotional immaturity. And so when you come home,
now I'm like, okay, I get it. You know, I'm owning my stuff now, and I'm like, hey, babe, what's up? You know, and now she is withdrawing,
Yes.
which is one of her
Yes.
responses when her core fear button has been pressed.
Yep.
So when I go to reach out after her or try to talk to her, and she pulls away, or she ignores, or like she doesn't hear me or anything, or any of those things, when she does that, okay, now my core fear button has been pressed again.
Yes.
Now another response comes out, right?
And then we start, come on now.
And now here, this is what we're doing. This is what we're doing now. We dancing. We're dancing. We're dancing. We're going in a cycle.
Yes.
We're going in a cycle, a dysfunctional cycle. And the crazy thing is that neither my wife or I may recognize what it is without the aid of the Spirit of God pointing us to, hey, Stephen, when you wanted to be intimate with Tamara and she told you she had a lot of things on her schedule and she wasn't going to be able to do it, maybe at another time, when she said that, you took that the wrong way. And this is why we mentioned what we did earlier in terms of taking ownership of our emotions, right? Is it true that my wife could have a lot of stuff on her plate to do? Yes. That's not a lie. Is she concocting this just to be able to keep me away from her, or keep me at bay? No. But again, when I'm listening to my core fear, when my core fear is talking to me, this is saying there's something wrong with you that makes your wife not desire you, right? And then we begin to act off of that. But when I can take ownership, I can say, wait, stop. Your wife has had a busy day. Why don't you see if you can help her to get done with some of the things that are on her schedule, that are on her plate, so that you can free her up? Who knows? Perhaps if she's done sooner than she expected to be done, maybe there will be time for intimacy. But instead, we run off and get into this dysfunctional cycle and start doing our thing. And it can go on, as we said earlier, it can go on for days, for weeks and months. And by the time it's at the month-long stage, we don't even really remember what it is that brought us there in the first place.
And you know, the other thing about the core fear test that I've also appreciated, because you mentioned something a moment ago about, we talked about telling ourselves the truth, right? And it's not only about me taking personal responsibility for my own emotions and my own reactions, but it also gives me a window into your heart. It gives me a window into what it is that you need. Now, that doesn't mean that I can always fulfill that need, because that's unrealistic. But you do, when you're in a relationship with someone, when your spouse is in need, when you have a keen awareness of what a big part of their needs are, it is a privilege to be able to say, man, you know what? He needs me this evening, or he needs me right now. Let me go sit with him. Let me go
every evening.
But that is a privilege. And so when you become aware of someone's needs, then you do have the ability to be able to minister. That's what I want to call it. You have the ability to be able to minister to that individual. Am I personally responsible for your feelings? No. Am I personally responsible for making you happy? No. Again, we cannot take personal responsibility for making someone else happy. We can actually share in their life as a part of them growing in their happiness. And so knowing that that is something that you need, that should make me say more, you know what? Man, let me just go sit and hug him. Let me go, or let's be intimate. Let me have that special moment with him, because this is something that speaks to him, to the very core of who he is. And I think that is very powerful. And there are many marriages, I think, that do end because we ignore those things, but because we didn't know, right? Whether you didn't know what the core fear is, or I wasn't aware just how strong this need is in your life. And vice versa.
And that doesn't mean that I won't still need to get away and take some time to think, cool off, or whatnot. But now when I do that, I'll respond to her text. I'll pick up the phone and I'll say, hey, babe, I just made a run for the border. I did a Taco Bell, get me a Slurpee and whatever. And now by doing that, I'm ministering. Or before I even walk out the door, hey babe, I'll be back. And just saying that, I'll be back, then what it does is it completely transforms the situation.
Yes.
Now I'm not leaving in anger. Now I'm not leaving while trying to ignore her voice or anything. I'm ministering to something that I know she needs. Now the truth is that there's power in what you're doing and what you're discovering about one another.
Yes.
Because it also reveals that now or unfortunately, help us, Lord. Now, because I know you need this, I know if I don't give it to you, I know it's going to hurt you.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And so if I really want to get back at you, if I really want to take a dig at you, then now I'll just leave and I won't say anything and I won't text you or whatever, because I know that's going to deeply disturb you, because I want you to hurt. This is dysfunctional, emotionally immature thinking.
And I was just going to say that that's an example of another stage of emotionally immature behavior.
But now I'm hurting, but because I haven't taken ownership of my hurt, you caused my hurt. Now I'm going to cause you to hurt.
Yeah.
You know?
That hurting people hurt people.
Yeah.
You get into that cycle. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So our goal then in our marriage, and you may say, how can marriages even, how can people do that? But it happens all the time. You hurt me, I hurt you. You hurt me, and people get into this vicious cycle. Is we're waiting for the next hurt, the next opportunity to hurt the individual. And you don't want to, trust me, marriages don't last very long.
Yeah.
With that.
You know what we call that? We call that PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yes.
And this is we could go a billion ways with this, but sometimes what we do is we bring the hurt. No, let me say this. Most times what we do, we bring the hurt of our families into our marriages.
Have mercy.
My father wasn't there. My mother wasn't there. They are going to, or they abandoned me. They left me. And I bring that stress and that trauma into my current relationship. And now I begin to treat my wife as though she's my mother, as though she's my father,
or
as though she's whoever
him.
hurt me, my abuser, etc., etc.
Yes.
And so what post-traumatic stress disorder is when I take a traumatic experience from my life and I impose it on the everyday experiences of my life now. So I bring the past into the present, and every experience becomes a trauma, including my marriage, which can be obviously detrimental for those who want to have a healthy marriage.
So the question is, and look, you expect that this is the question, right? After all of this stuff, how do I prevent this from happening? And maybe you're already in the cycle, right? We are under no illusion that there aren't people who are watching this and they're like, man, that's actually us.
Right now.
That's what we do, And guess what? You can actually get off of the roller coaster, but it takes someone making the conscious effort to do it. I'm going to be honest with you. Sometimes you're in a relationship and everybody's not there yet, right? One person is ready to examine themselves and look at their core fears, and the other person may not. But what we've witnessed in relationships is this. If there's one individual who is willing to take ownership and say, you know what, I'm going to do the work. I'm going to do what I need to do to examine myself and see what it is that I bring to the table. The funny thing that I see happen is that when you begin to change, when your reactions, right, and when your responses and those things, it actually causes the other individual to not have anybody to dance with.
And here's the thing. You look crazy when you're dancing by yourself. And people looking at you, and you start looking at yourself like, okay.
I look crazy.
Let me say that for the shower.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? But it does. It does. It looks really crazy when you're
just
in something
shadow
by
boxing yourself. We talk about that. We'll talk about it in another video.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's important, and I think that you can make the decision now to prepare your future marriage for not getting into the dance, right? Or at least recognizing when it's getting ready to start, so you can be equipped, because we're all about tools, right?
That's right.
This is another tool in your arsenal to help you to not to repeat or to build this dysfunction. And maybe you've already started in your marriage. Guess what? You can choose to get off of the roller coaster or stop the dance, right? But it takes the decision of actually utilizing the tool and putting it to use in your own life.
So we talked about, what our fear dance looks like, what our cycle looks like. And again, just coming back briefly to that question of how do I get off of the merry-go-round? How do I get out of this revolving door or this cycle of dysfunction or this dance that I'm a part of? And we mentioned this earlier, but we wanted to come back and just to touch on it a little bit more. And in the book DNA of Relationships, Gary Smalley brings this out. He talks about taking ownership of our own emotions, otherwise known as taking responsibility for our own emotions. Now, in our culture, you know, the politician cheats on his wife and then stands up and says, I take full responsibility for my actions. Will you be stepping down from your position? No, I will not be stepping down from my position, and I will continue on in my marriage. So in other words, taking responsibility, it can become kind of fuzzy. Like it's the right thing to say in a stressor of a situation, just to say I take responsibility, but not actually knowing what that means. So when we talk about taking ownership or taking responsibility of for one's emotions and then for one's responses, first let's deal with the emotions. What that means is that I no longer can blame Tamara for feeling the way that I do. If I take ownership, if I take responsibility for my emotions, then it's no longer, well, if you would have only been intimate with me, right? How many times have men said, well, I wasn't having enough sex with my wife at home, and therefore I went out and I did, right? Or how many wives? My husband wasn't satisfying me, therefore I went out and, right? Or you weren't making enough money, therefore I had to go out and. None of those is what we're talking about. When we say take ownership and responsibility, what that means is, and this is what it sounds like, my fears caused me to see something that really wasn't there. And that's the reason why I. See what I'm saying? Notice what's missing from that. Well, you said, well, you did, and then I only. When we take responsibility and when we take ownership, tremendous difference. And I'll tell you, this dynamic can radically change not only your marriage relationship, but it can change any relationship that you are in. Because what you're doing is you are taking responsibility for your emotions and the way you feel. You're taking it away from that individual and you're owning it. I feel this way. And here's one of the, because you might be thinking, well, what if they did do something? Right. Here's the thing though, right? I brought the core fear of rejection into this marriage relationship. Right? She didn't bring it in. I did. And so when this core fear of rejection pops up in our marriage experience, it's because I had it in my luggage. Right? This is something I brought. You know what I'm saying? And so now look, I ain't gonna say that. Well, yeah, I will say it. You know, when my parents used to send us over somebody's house, they would say, look, let's check all your clothes and let's make sure you ain't taking nothing with you. And then when we would come back from somebody's house, everybody ain't gonna know what I'm talking about, but somebody will. You know, and when we would come home, let's make sure you ain't bring no extra guests with you. You know what I'm saying? But this core fear of rejection was in my luggage. I brought this here. And so when it pops up in the relationship, it's not her fault, it's mine. Right? And so what I have to do is I have to take responsibility for what I've brought into the marriage. And likewise, Tamara takes responsibility for the core fears that she brings into the marriage. And so our conversations, because who wants to be in a conversation where you're the one that's causing this?
Right. And the truth is that when we tell people this all the time, I can in no way change you. We don't have the power or the ability as individuals to change other people. What God has given us is He's given us the power and ability to do self-examination, to come to God with what we have discovered based on what He's revealed to us, right? And we can surrender that to God. And as we surrender that to God, there comes healing, right? There comes an understanding. And as you heal and as you be able to grow, it impacts the other individuals. And we say individuals because this core fear test isn't just about marriage. This is good for parent-child relationship. This is good for boss-employee relationship. This is good for neighbor relationship. This is good for any relationship dynamic that you are in, because it's about us, like you said, taking personal stock of what it is that I bring to the table when I am in community, when I'm in communication with other individuals.
Yeah, and there's two more things that we can touch on here. And we actually mentioned them earlier, but hopefully just try to unpack them a little bit. You said something. Well, first, before we go to what you said, so first there's taking personal responsibility and ownership for my emotions. Second, taking ownership and personal responsibility for my responses. Right? See, and this is how that thing works together. If I'm blaming you for making me feel the way I feel, then I no longer can take responsibility for how I respond.
Yes.
Right? Because if you wouldn't have said, if you wouldn't have done, then I wouldn't have. But listen, if I call my wife out of her name,
which you not.
If I call my children out of their names, right? If any of that goes down, there's no way I can blame that on her.
That's right.
You see what I'm saying? That is something that that I and I alone have control over. Well, you say, well, what if she hit you upside the head with something? Even if she hits me upside the head with something, I still am in control by God's grace, or I should be, or I can be in control of what my response is to that. And here's that core fear thing again, right? Oh, how you gonna let her hit you? You ain't no man. She think you a punk. She think you see what the core fear is telling me? You see what I'm saying? And if I let that core fear take control and have the narrative, then now I'm responding based on that something that's not true. You see what I'm saying? And so we have to take responsibilities for our responses, for the things we say, right? If I'm trying to hurt you because I feel hurt, and remember those two things go together, my emotions and my responses. That's why they're both a part of the core fear thing, because they're linked closely together.
And don't you dare believe the old adage, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words, that's not true. Words hurt. They cut deep. And I've often heard that sometimes words hurt worse than
the physical.
But both of them don't have no business happening. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So call the police or something if you're going through some domestic violence. Nobody got time for that. But another thing that is really important, and I think we'll end on this, which is...
No, we're going to end on one more thing.
Okay. One thing that is so important is this. Fear is one thing, but one of the things that I love about God, about Christ, and about a relationship that seeks to honor Christ is this. Is that God comes into the relationships with us, even with our baggage, even with our dysfunction. And there are promises that fit into every luggage that we bring with us.
Yes.
All of these core fears have an answer to them.
Yes.
In fact, Scripture has over 360 fear nots mentioned in Scripture. So that means to me, in reality, that God understands and He knows that fear is a big issue for human beings.
Yeah. That
fear will take us under, and that the enemy's idea is this: if I can get them to live in fear 365 days a year, that I got them. Their marriage, their children, their relationships will sink under this fear. But God promises that if we bring the fear to Him and we lay it at His feet, that He in turn has an exchange for us, that we don't have to fear. I don't have to be ruled by my fear of abandonment, right? God promises that I will never leave you or forsake you. I will never leave you alone. I can trust Him because, listen, the truth is, relationships, things happen. But God is sure and He's true. You have promises, right? That you are enough, right? You are fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image.
And here's what I love about that. And actually, this is the one thing that I was going to end on too.
I knew it.
So, but what I love is God speaks to us at the core of our being, right?
Yes.
And if rejection is at the core, abandonment is at the core, invalidation, all of those, I'm not good enough, whatever the core fear may be. If those things are at the very core of who I am, those 365 or more fear nots means that God speaks to me and He speaks to you at the very core of our being. So what God says to me is, and I love it because God doesn't lie to me. He doesn't say, Stephen, you're perfect. No, He says, listen, while you were yet a sinner, I exemplified and demonstrated my love for you in giving my Son. So yes, you do have imperfections, but my love is more powerful than your imperfections. And your imperfections don't scare me. I love you. In fact, He says, for those childhood traumas, before you were formed in your mother's womb, I knew you. I called you. You see what I'm saying? And so God, He speaks, He knows how to speak to us at the very core of who we are. And so whatever the core fear is, the answer to that is found in the Word of God.
Yes.
And this is the beautiful thing, sweetie. The beautiful thing is that our happiness, and now you got to sit up for this. Put your seatbelt on. Tighten your belt buckle for this one. As beautiful as my wife is, and as beautiful as our marriage is, this core fear thing that we're talking about, it helps me to take the responsibility of my happiness off of the shoulders of my wife. So she no longer has to bear the responsibility for always making me happy. So if I'm wearing a long face, she no longer, oh man, what did I do? Oh man, what is it going to be now? She shouldn't have to live like that, because my happiness is no longer dependent upon her, right? Why? We talked about ownership and responsibility. One of my favorite authors by the name of C.S. Lewis, he had a friend, and his friend's wife was dealing with a terminal illness. And C.S. Lewis wrote to his wife, Shelton Van Auken, I think was his friend's name. And C.S. Lewis wrote to his friend, Van Auken. He said, listen, anything or anyone that we put in the place of God, we are setting that thing or that individual up to perpetually, that means constantly, disappoint us. Because my wife, as good as she is, she can never be as good as God.
That's right.
Right? If my wife is sick, God forbid, or tired, God forbid, or injured, listen to what God says. He says, I will never leave you or forsake you. But because of physical illness or sickness, my wife may not be able to be there for me. You see what I'm saying? Or vice versa. I may not be able to be there for my wife.
If you lose a job,
Absolutely.
if something happens and you get sick, or, all types of things happen in life. And I know this is countercultural. It really is. We live in a world where we put our happiness on other people. And when they disappoint us, we throw them away.
Yeah.
Right? Like rags. Like I can't tell you how many times I see people talk about that. My happiness is most important. And it's just like, wow, and no wonder there's so many broken relationships, because we disappoint each other, because we're imperfect human beings, So there's a difference between happiness and joy. There's a difference between what out here in the world they tell us what happiness is, And so again, that's why we always come back to the foundation being God, because at the end of the day, that's what it's going to take. In order to face the real obstacles and the real circumstances that take place in real relationships.
And let me drop this on you. The real obstacle is not her. The real obstacle for her is not me.
Yes.
The biggest obstacle for me is me. The biggest obstacle for her is her. You see what I'm saying? It's not what she's thinking. It's what I'm thinking about what she's thinking. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So we are our own worst enemies.
Yes.
And the only one, she can't change me because she doesn't know what I'm thinking. The only person who's able to help me to change, this is why the psalmist prayed in Psalm 51, create in me a clean heart, O God. Search me, O God.
Which is really your
this
mind.
Is Psalm 139, search me, O God.
Yes.
And know my thoughts. Try me and see if there be any wicked way in me. And then Jeremiah chapter 17, I, the Lord, know the heart. I search the reins. So because God knows me better than I know myself, he can help me to see myself, and he can also liberate me from the chains that bind me, that are in my own mind. And he can help me to experience satisfaction and joy and peace apart from her. So that, listen, now I bring satisfaction, joy, and peace into the relationship.
Yes.
And she's bringing that, hopefully, into the relationship.
Yes.
And so this is a blessing.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
This is a blessing that we bring. And this is all a process. None of this happens
overnight.
Just like that. It's a process.
Yeah.
But taking ownership of our emotions, and then taking ownership and responsibility for our responses.
Yes.
And then finally, depending on God as the source of our true happiness, and not making my wife into my God. Because if I do that, she's only going to disappoint me.
Every time.
She didn't make my favorite for breakfast. She didn't want to be intimate with me. She forgot my birthday. Oh, she forgot it was my anniversary. She forgot I liked it, right? Constant disappointment, right? Because only God can really satisfy in those ways. And here's the last part of what C.S. Lewis wrote to Van Auken. He said, it's only as we put the gifts that God has given us in their proper place that we can enjoy them to the full extent that God designed us to enjoy them.
Amen.
Which means that I can fully enjoy my wife as God intends me to enjoy her, as I take her off of God's throne and put her in the queen's throne of this home, right? And then I can enjoy her the way that God intended, and she can enjoy me, vice versa. Look, it's our prayer that you are able to enjoy one another the way that God intended for you to enjoy one another. No more of the constant, cyclical disappointment because you're expecting too much from one another. No more blaming one another for your unhappiness or so forth and so on, but taking ownership of your emotions and your responses and trusting God to be the one who makes us happy.
And ultimately, you're breaking generational cycles.
Yes.
Generational curses. And man, when you see that happen, oh boy, we are a testimony to that God is good, to be able to raise your children and not pass along that dysfunction, to not pass along, those things. And so I'm just thankful, for this exercise. And I pray that you all take full advantage, make about 100 copies, because you're going to need them.
As many as you need. As many as you need.
Yes.
God bless.
All right, and stay tuned for the next video.
Now, your homework. The homework for your next video is you don't have any. Maybe you can do another one or two of those core fears if you reach any bumpy or rocky roads. But our next video, we're going to talk to you about communication. We're going to start talking about communication. So we've kind of, dibbled and dabbled with a little bit here and there. So you'll see that we've mentioned some of the things that are going to be profoundly important.
Yes.
Look forward to seeing you next time.